Hello everyone, today we talk about Peter Waldo and more in general of the Waldensian movement in this historical context of the evangelic pauperism between repression and legalization, right? So today we will mostly take a look at the end of the 12th and the beginning of the 13th century. We actually made, if you go in the medieval Christianity playlist, some videos. One is the preaching of Peter Waldo can work as an introduction to today's video, and another one that is actually more about the Dominicans and the Franciscans, that is the integration of the pauperistic-evangelical movements in the Roman Church. We actually made a video also on Catharism, on the repression of the Albigensians, etc. And I realized that we haven't actually dealt very thoroughly with this very important moment of ecclesiastical history. And recently we made quite an amount of videos about the Gregorian reforms and the struggle, the investiture controversy, let's say. And we will have to actually concentrate deeply in the 12th century, observing this moment as actually one of the most tense and chaotic in part of ecclesiastical history, and realizing how these movements actually were all part of a broader current that we call in fact pauperistic-evangelical or penitential, whatever you want, that had actually stemmed from the same Gregorian times, like this concept of purification of the church, and what even the same struggle for investitures had to bring to. Now, the Roman Church had won it essentially against the Germanic emperors, especially on the Italian soil proper, as in Germany there were other prerogatives that instead were maintained by the emperor. But as always, the thing is much more complicated. But we have to pay attention here at the general context also. When we talk about this specific groups, right, that of course are, for example, it's plenty of material. If you search, I suspect here on YouTube, I don't know, about the Waldensian Church, surely there's plenty of stuff made by Waldensian community and telling its history, etc. But this moment in history is very broad, it's very large. Like, so it actually it's fine to kind of track the history of these communities, kind of concentrating on them if you're interested, but also understanding what the whole picture really was. And we will see that even drawing kind of a sharp difference at the very beginning between all these it's very complicated, but with the same orthodoxy. Another prejudice that we have that has been fueled, and that's why I say it historiographically, especially after the Reformation, right, from both sides, either from Catholicism and Protestantism, this sense that, these movements were, I don't know, modern free thinkers ante litteram, right, and that were trying to free themselves as autonomous churches, and so it's actually a very dangerous concept, right? At this point, the Roman Church, at least in Western Christianity, the Roman Church was the referential point. All these groups had an enormous trust and faith and respect towards the Roman Church, towards the popes that were seen, of course, at every election, like those would have to bring to the Christianity to eventually the ultimate purification by that would have preceded also all the eschatological perspectives as well, etc. And so I think it's very interesting to concentrate on how all these factors were intertwined at the time, and how eventually these groups only formed and defined better themselves, also through actual repression, persecution, but still in a context that at the time wasn't so differentiated as we think substantially. And we could start with the decretal ad abolendum, right, and the anathema that was launched in it principally against the Cathars and the Patarians. We made a video also, about the not specifically about the Patari as such, but we discussed it. If you search Schwerpunkt Patarians, or Pataria, you should be able to find it. It's all there in the Medieval Christianity playlist. But Cathars and Patarians were conceptually assimilated by the Roman Church, right? So that obviously was interested at that point to frame better who the enemies and the friends were in that regard, were heterodoxy laid and orthodoxy did. So the problem here was even understanding who was who, because these movements were spreading like crazy all over Europe, and it was particularly complicated to even investigate what the mindset of many communities actually was, right? And as history would prove, actually, that there was a very strong political and social commitment, especially from the side of the elites, whether lay or ecclesiastical, to stick together against certain positions that were threatening the very hierarchy that the elite embodied, that the elite controlled fundamentally, both in secular as well as in ecclesiastical and spiritual matters. And that, however, proves also that in the Middle Ages, this great oppression, like there didn't quite exist, because actually the heresy was a problem as long as it actually put in discussion not much the whole system as it was conceived, because we've seen at the time that the system was not discussed. Nobody ever said, here we have to get rid of the Church of Rome. This was literally about keep living within it, but with different interpretations and with different sublimations and totalizations, if you want, that naturally weren't just strictly religious matters. Like the 12th century sees even rise revolts that would also had very bloody outcomes, not just because they were repressed, but actually because they were actively killing. And this was naturally a problem that invested the whole spectrum of society. So that's why I was saying before, we should contextualize this all into what this really was, because even, as every specialist of this field knows, nobody considers this matters anymore as just strictly spiritual or religious. They were political, they were social, they were even military at some point, right? There was an actual difficulty even of bringing order back again in certain areas, especially when certain political authorities were even siding in part with them. That's why, for example, the Albigensian Crusade happened, right? It wasn't just because there were Cathars in there, and who were the Cathars, by the way? We do realize at this point, in historiographically speaking, that it's very difficult actually to answer this question, because most of the sources we have were the ones of those who, of the Roman Church, or the French, the Northern French, that launched those crusades, and that were naturally justifying it on the basis of this alleged heresy that definitely existed in some form, in these broader forms that, by the way, there is immense discussion whether there was contact between the Paulicians and these other Gnostic movements that fundamentally were bringing back all the many of the same concepts actually that had spread as the first heresies in Christendom in the first centuries after Christ. So this broad picture is important, and from this decretal we naturally see that Cathars and Patarians were conceived as just the leading symbols of many other, if not all, just other movements, whatever they could be spotted, like of spiritual perfection and of evangelic integralism, which is what it really was, right? These were movements like the Arnoldists, for example, or the Pasaginians, or the Josephinians, that were destined, in these cases, for example, to enjoy actually a limited resonance, right? And that were, however, expression of this religious revival, right? And religious, I would say, religiosity revival more than else. These were different ways of literally perceiving what religion had to be, what the same church had to stick to in terms of models and of lifestyle. That naturally in the pauperistic-evangelical definition are expressed in this sense. All you need is the Bible, more or less, like freely interpreted for sure, but also more or less understood, right? Frequent criticism, as we will see today, to these movements, that they preach like freedom of reading the Bible, of providing sacraments, etc., without the sacerdotal mediation, but that these people most of the times didn't even know how to translate from Latin, right? And therefore the interpretations were quite debatable in Orthodox terms, right? Not all of them, of course, but largely in movements that at that point had not strictly to do with religion, but just in a different way of seeing the world, because, I don't know, these people were poor, for example. They just wanted to, they were repressed and, tired, fed up, even of the 12th century is a moment of great social and political stratification. It is true that these groups were brought and were taken under, right? And they were losing their freedoms, were losing sometimes everything they had at the point that they, when you arrive to that point, you have nothing else to lose, and that's why you start being violent, because substantially you don't have any other option, right? So I don't know how much this period has been studied, militarily speaking, overall, because it's intertwined with many other phenomena, especially in France, where, as we will see, in fact, the same poors of Lyon, in fact, emerged. We've seen the Brabançons, the Routiers, all these movements of disinherited individuals who had at that point nothing to lose, and many would choose different options, right? Even the separation between the spiritual sphere and the military one, how can you divide it in the age of crusades, right? It doesn't even make sense. So it's very, very important to observe it, and naturally this was posing an enormous problem to the Roman Church, that had surely won its space after the investiture controversies to rise and to expand, but that was essentially throughout all the 12th century struggling and very closely, like to the defeat against these movements, right? So it's these were all movements that in part would die out, right? They were either reabsorbed by orthodoxy, or they were literally wiped out. Like this is very shaded, but it's indeed and principally the epopee of the Poors of Lyon and of the Humiliated, also condemned, in fact, by the decretal of Pope Lucius III, to constitute between the 12th and the 13th century the most paradigmatic cases of the action of papacy in front of religious dissidents. And the Poors of Lyon were followers of a movement that was born probably during a famine in the 70s of the 12th century, around the figure of a merchant known as Waldo, in fact, or Valdesius, whatever. These figures are naturally very fascinating. These were great, very able, very charismatic, and who knew their business, definitely. We had experienced this struggle, this inherent problem. This idea of wealth, of material wealth. Here we see, in fact, Waldo being a merchant, um, Saint Francis of Assisi being a son of a wealthy merchant, and all having therefore a strong contact with what had objectively never happened, like since centuries in Europe at this point. That is this wealth overflow. It's not surprising that these movements expand in some of the most, in some of the wealthiest and rapidly growing areas of Europe. Here, think about southern France, objectively was very rich. Italy, too, very rich. The Patarians, same Waldensians spread easily, quickly in the same Italy, and why? Because there was this stronger, ever stronger contrast in a society that had been used from the previous centuries to just live essentially of almost, let's say, survival rate production, right, of surplus, to this immense wealth due to trade, to this great industries and manufacturers that were spreading exactly in these areas, as a matter of fact, and that all of a sudden confronted these Christians with the problem of possessing enormous quantities of goods, of wealth, right, and leaving this as a sort of sin, right, and feeling the inherent differences that were beginning to appear within society, right? Not all earned in the same way, hence social stratification followed, and we know, in fact, on their deathbeds, many of these merchants that were extremely rich at one point would donate, even, not literally everything, but really enormous parts of their wealth for, being saved, of not considering this trade as something that they could lose their soul with, because material possessions are, criticized, of course, in the holy books, not much because of possession in itself, right, but for the attachment, right, for the dependency on this, the moral dependency on them, right. So that's where the tension inherently comes from, and that's why also all these kind of Gnostic oriented movements and perceptions and views of the world, like the one that Catharism was stereotypically conceived like, emerged, because these Neoplatonic movements were essentially stressing the evil of matter, right, the evil of material goods, and all what distracted the good Christian from his spiritual duties. So the Waldensians emerged as makers of a type of voluntary poverty, right, like many others. That was lived also keeping actually the exercise of, for example, handcrafts, like manufacturing activities, and in the itinerant penitential preaching, right. Of course, these communities had to live in an organized fashion, like they couldn't go around. They weren't, before we draw this kind of dramatic picture, of course there were kind of extremist and violent fringes in these groups, but largely these were also, let's say, it's as if society had been crossed, like all these waves of spirituality that encompassed many, right, especially in the cities, in areas that were, civilized by definition, that had a regulation, but where these agitations were starting being perceived and felt, and the great problem of these communities was, in fact, the degree of radicalism that they had to accept, like, because according to these, they should have lived theoretically without almost nothing. According to some, others said, okay, well, but we also must live and earn our bread kind of legally, so we have to produce something, we have to work, we have to own, right? Here hence property and all the problems revolving around it and these concepts. And unfortunately, we don't know much about these figures. Like we ignore largely what the true communitary life was in these groups. Not much because of the further the repression that ensued, of course, that historiographically kind of obscured much of the reality of this, but also because we are talking about the 12th century, that objectively is not a dramatically documented time, so that we know actually very, very few about even many other parts of society. And the Waldensians presented themselves, and this is the proof actually of their, of course, good disposition towards the Church of Rome, to Pope Alexander III in the March 1179, right? These are important years. This is, a moment after which the papacy and the Lombard League had defeated the emperor. So it's a moment of great revival and reorganization of the Roman Church. In fact, this meeting happened during the works of the Third Lateran Council, and the Waldensians asked the Pope for the approval of a French, because they were a French community, vulgarization of the Psalter. Right, the Psalter is the biblical book over which usually were learned the first rudiments of reading and of prayer, right? So they were quite of a common book that that witnesses, of course, even the spread of literacy among the lower classes, of course, with all the limits, etc. And that began from this text, and this request was framed into a program of religious education of the layman, founded on the concept of personal reading of the holy texts, right? And this was very important for the Waldensians, because the same Waldo had converted after having read himself the Bible, and therefore, remaining struck by what was revealed to him, and therefore deciding to extend this form of, let's say, free, relation, free, direct contact, let's say, with the actual holy text to other people, and to the laymen that usually. In fact, they were laymen, right? They were involved into, and here, what I mean is that, of course, the majority of literate people at this time was the clergy, but objectively, it's exactly the mercantile urban classes, like the one Waldo belonged to, that were beginning at this point to be able to read, right? And to therefore starting questioning and thinking, and these were dynamic people who dealt with money and goods and political affairs at the end of the day. So there were people who had an autonomous intellectual curiosity and need and possibility to practically even have a book and read it, which seems strange, but at the time it was not, because just having a book was a big deal, right? And the spread of actual literacy, not just reading, right, is important in these movements, with all the imperfections that, of course, were in fact also pointed out in the specific context. The Poors of Lyon demanded, furthermore, to be dispensed from the prohibition of the layman, right, the application of which had costed the Waldensians their same expulsion from the diocese of Lyon, right? And this was a big deal, in fact, because we don't actually know what had happened, because the sources are kind of contradictory. They do not actually tell us even if Waldo was given the preaching license from the papacy. So we can't say, this was a struggle that had been born in France, right? At Lyon, the local bishop. What happened in Rome, we don't actually, it's not actually certain. What all we know though is that this pedagogic, let's say Waldensian pedagogic program, was insisting on lay preaching in itself, and in the request of the right to preaching, the Waldensians were essentially mouthpiece, spoke people of a anti-Catholic commitment that was in fact contained in the Liber Anti-Heresis of Durand of Huesca, that was written between 1179 and 1184, with the objective, by the way, to obtain the legitimization of the apostolate of the Poors of Lyon. And this is very interesting because it proves actually even the aversion to and commitment against the Cathars that at this point were starting to be, as we've seen with the Cretal Lucius III, to be attacked directly, to be exposed, and that the Albigensian Crusade was in the air, let's say, and this was naturally a political bargaining and negotiation, but it still meant a lot on the ground of showing the good disposition of these movements to the same authority of the Roman Church. They were confident enough they could obtain this preaching license even as laymen, or those of them who were laymen, by the way, that because there were priests, of course, among them as well. This reveals to you how actually the concept of protest, of I don't know how to say that, contestation, etc., towards the Church of Rome was not the matter here. Was not even refusing it in terms like a new pope could, for example. We don't know what happened in the first place, but the ecclesiastical policy, papal policy, could change over time. So, having obtained the authorization to practice, at least instead, the evangelical poverty and to live it in a communitary form, Waldo did not manage to stem the growing hostility of the clergy that exploded violently again around the years 1182-83, when in the dioceses of Lyon began to preach also some women, which was, this unleashed the first violent reaction against the usurpation of this right that was not just clerical one. So it was not just about the laymen wanted to preach, but also it was exclusively male. Women could not, right, be priests. So the new Archbishop of Lyon was Jean Belmain, revoked to Waldo the verbal authorization of preaching, as it had been granted by his predecessor, by the former Bishop of Lyon. So now Waldo was expressively forbidden to preach in any form, right? And de facto this would cause the main the main problem, like the main break, as Waldo naturally, at this point had, as far as we know, had remained fairly obedient, fairly within the rules. Now he responded by appealing to, as all the Waldensians would do from that moment onwards, to the verse of the Act of the Apostles, in which it's remembered the necessity to obey to God and not to man, right? Which is, not heretical interpretation. It's literally what is written here, but naturally it has several interpretations depending also which use you want to make of it. Who has ever interpreted the Bible in a equal way? Actually, historically, these matters show that it is really not the case. And so this brought to the framing of the Waldensians among the list of the heretics that were condemned, as we were seeing at the beginning of the video, in the Ad Abolendam Decretal that remembered them expressly as non-authorized preachers, right? So it's in this period, roughly 1184, in which the first groups of the Poors of Lyon had already organized themselves in northern Italy, and probably during a stop of Waldo in Lombardy during his travel towards Rome that he carried out between the 1179 and 1180. These communities were strengthening and organizing and having, this is a great problem because this is often an overlooked chapter of ecclesiastical history that is very evident, would be very evident especially with the Franciscans later on, that were in fact dramatically closer to these groups than the Dominicans were, that were kind of a more institutionalized, more framed and obedient group. That these peoples didn't quite understand. I mean, ideas traveled, but communities didn't. Most of them. I mean, of course, the communities traveled as such, but the majority of these groups remained where they lived. And the problem is that these ideas spread, but every group kind of organized itself accordingly. And of course, there were contacts between the two. They kind of organized themselves to cooperate. But this would originate from certain, like even in Franciscan times, that even in a deviation from the actual contents of the preaching. Like many Franciscans of the first hour that were from France, from Germany, from England, they knew about the Franciscan ideas, but they actually had never known who Saint Francis had been, what he actually said, right? They reorganized themselves, even with the church approval at that point. And this tells you how these movements weren't actually much about the strict interpretation of the Bible in a particular way, and what was characterized as an heresy, doctrinally speaking, as such, but actual different needs and authorization for leading a certain type of life, for adapting to new political and social situations and contexts that were emerging at that point. And all the medieval communities were, especially of international scale, were divided usually in corporations, just like the crafts and arts and the universities that were very often actually on a national base, right? They were all these groups that called themselves, the Lombards, the French, and all of this, right? And developing very often as things on their own, right? Independently. And the great problem of these movements was also creating a connection that, in this sense, could go beyond the actual, these were communities that weren't born out of pre-existing political social structures, right? They had something in common very often in terms of social belonging. There were a lot of people from many different classes. So the part of the reason why these movements would ultimately fail substantially in their broader ambitions is that they weren't organized. They didn't have what the Roman Church had. That was an actual, an enormous amount of land, of power, political connections, of infrastructures, of systems of educations, right? And this is a testament to the value of civilization in an organized form, right? And these guys struggled, but it's obvious that if you found everything on a not better specified freedom of interpretation, like where will you get eventually? If it's just about preaching as a layman, but it's obvious that in a society like the medieval one, this thing is fundamentally, you can say, doomed to fail. But how can you make a difference, especially in a century like this, where the political and social structures are rapidly evolving in a markedly hierarchical form, right? And as we were saying before, these movements were actually originated by the same protest against these new hierarchies and trying to create some of them on their own, but definitely not having the same amount of wealth and power that it was required at this point to achieve that. So, at the beginning of the 13th century, the Waldensian movement, though, was largely witnessed in various parts of Europe. The excommunication of Lucius III had triggered a sort of radicalization that led emerging certain extremist attitudes. And these demands didn't stop just to the right of preaching, as we're saying just right now, but also to the one of administering the sacraments, including the Eucharist, right? So that this is a big deal, even if actually celebrated in this specific case just like a commemorative act, right? But still was, the first step to obtain something more, and it's on such base that would mature the definitive break with the Church of Rome, right? The turning point having been, in fact, the first, let's say, legalization of preaching, and now, the situation having been exasperated. And this break happened between 1208 and 1210, when actually Waldo had just died, and in spite there had already been within the movement certain actually favorable tendencies to the reconciliation with the papacy. So in virtue of these, of the latter, were included within the orthodoxy two groups headed respectively by Durand of Huesca, that we mentioned before, and Bernard Primus, that were actually in turn within this community founders of the of two other smaller groups that were the Catholic poors and the reconciled poors, respectively. So they had actually, the names give you all the hint here that they were fully framed within the orthodoxy, that is Catholicism as such, which means universal, so very far from any form of externalization from the Roman Church. And they reconciled, that were with this name recognizing that there had been a former contrast, right? And these two currents would actually extinguish very rapidly, because simply they were absorbed by other Orthodox religious experiences. And under the blows of the Inquisition, that was evolving exactly and specifically in this moment, because of the jurisdictional dispositions contained in the Ad Abolendam Decretal, the Waldensian movement and its groups so progressively, their resizement of their movement within the public apostolate, starting to become just like it had been for the Cathars, actually a small alternative church to the Roman one with its own doctrinal configuration that the Catholic historiography defines like this, that essentially the Waldensians refused manual work. At this point, they lived of charity, and they exalted the celibate or the separation of the grooms. They believed in the divinity of Christ at the state of sin of men, and to salvation through Jesus Christ. And they also preserved the sacrament of penitence and of the Eucharist, but they denied the transubstantiation and the community of the saints, which is an important, very, very important discontinuity, and they sustained that every righteous man can preach the gospel to absolve from sins and to commemorate the supper. And so they were, however, rapidly pushed to organize into a church with a hierarchy of prefects and an initiation that remembered the Cathar Consolamentum, as it was called. Also, they considered the Bible as the supreme authority, and this spread, this is according to, of course, Catholic interpretation, kind of sort of hurried or hasty translations of the New Testament and of the prophetic books in vernacular language. Now, that was another big deal as well, and we can naturally believe that they actually translated in kind of non-appropriate and not accurate ways, but also we lack some information. Now, what is important here, what has happened, is that this group naturally has been marginated, but it still survived. Initially, it kind of abandoned its broader social organization ambitions. It lives, as we have seen here, we've seen of charity, and they, but at the same time, in order to survive as a church as such, they united into something more hierarchical, and at this point, remaining at the margin of orthodoxy. What is important here is the entering into play of the Inquisition, right? The ad abolendum decretal, as we were saying before, had entrusted to the rectors of the communities the material application of the punishments that were inflicted for the crime of heresy, right? And the Waldensians were targeted in this sense. Consider also the geographical dimension. There were, from the Roman perspective, the majority of in France and in other areas were so-called the Ultramontani, because they were north of the Alps from Italy. The others were instead the Lombard Poors that had actually detached from the Waldensian movement before the death of Waldo. And then there were the Leonists of Germany as well, because the German cities of the Rhineland had seen similar spread of these ideas between the urban centers, just like it had happened in southern France and in northern Italy. So here you understand what the basis of the Waldensian movements began like, right? How they effectively began at this point, like a real church on its own, right? And as such being fought from the Catholic side. And there was a lot, naturally, of Catholic polemical contents against the Waldensians that actually, is very ancient, very old, and it went on for a very long time. It has its roots in the same summe of the inquisitors, right? And the modern synthesis of it is a problem because we don't know much about this medieval phase of Waldensian history for real, right? And therefore, we have to rely even on Catholic material that naturally was biased against them. And the Catholic view stresses a sort of forced involution of the movement that was indeed, it is kind of realistic in the sense that it was repressed by the ecclesiastical structures, and that transformed, as we have seen, these communities of itinerant preachers of the 12th century in small sedentary groups that sometimes survived, as we know, in the Alpine valleys, and that in fact preserve still today the Waldensian denomination. And therefore the Waldensian Church grew in this geographical and cultural isolation, exactly in these marginal areas where the Protestant historiography would have kind of spotted them and valorized in the reconstruction of their medieval roots. So if the decretal that had been born from the meeting in Verona of Lucius III and Frederick I of Hohenstaufen had ratified, with the activation of the inquisitorial instrument, the condemnation of all the lay aspirations towards the apostolic life and the evangelic preaching, this decision had still not found actually given a sound answer, aside the repressive one, to the strong religious demand that came from society. Right, these groups had been imported, whatever independently from repression in itself. It's of course natural that many communities were still dissatisfied with this solution. So it was a great problem for the church itself to simply repress like it had done. So the ferments that were manifested at the end of the 12th century tended especially to realize certain associative forms among laymen that, with the most different names, began to multiply both around the church and outside of it. And there were new instruments that were rediscovered, such as the canonical penitence, that was some of norms of behavior that the church had imposed to the public sinners, that however were reconciliated in order to allow them the reintegration within Christian society, and that were adapted in this case to the new religious experiences and transferred from the individual level, within which essentially they had prevailed and operated up to that point, to an associative and communitary one. So the penitential objective that characterized strongly the identity of figures such as the pilgrim or the crusader, that were protagonists of adventures that could be thought and felt, right, as a moment of non-return, right, became, let's say, better, the expression of permanent conversion, to the ideal of which were inspired both isolated individuals and entire collectivities. Now, this is important because this is somewhat what would for example, the mendicant orders would begin to be based, like a moment of as a response to this repression that had evidently proven that a broader let's say the creation of a political and social hierarchy in parallel to the Orthodox one. It wasn't possible, right? Because the lay and ecclesiastical elites would have repressed them quite brutally, like it happened with the Albigensians themselves, and therefore this need to live in a different dimension, in a different lifestyle, in a different spiritual commitment and forms opened to this new moment of and these new movements actually that were leaving with this ideal of permanence in their status of for example of itinerance, or at least detached but somewhat compatible with the Orthodox ones, or at least those who, because here they weren't technically, up to the point weren't denounced, or even if they weren't heretical, of course, and that's the problem we were saying before. Like, these movements were eventually repressed only when they were openly in opposition to any authority that could, at that point, respond to their instances. So this climate produced a new religious sensitivity that in turn created new associative formulas. In the period that goes between the last 30 years of the 12th century, especially in the countries of Northern Europe, groups of pious women began to unite in places close to a church to lead, especially either with manual work or recurring to charity, poor and communitary life, segmented, let's say, divided between the exercise of prayer and of penitence, right? And these were the Beguinage that had so much following, actually, later on in Flanders, especially, and in Central Eastern Europe during the 13th century, especially, creating a devotional female movement that will know similar developments also in Italy during the same 13th but also the 14th century. And the work was meant, especially in its penitential acception, such like a compensation, of course impossible, but let's say a form of a purification from partial purification from original sin, and at a certain time, a instrument of redemption that was certainly lived as the mimesis of apostolic life that appears, in fact, constantly in many of the communitary experiments of this period, assuming sometimes, just like in the cases of the Humiliated, for example, that were, as we've seen, listed among the heretics in the Ad Abolendam Decretal, almost the characteristics of sanctity, right? And in front of this changed religious sense, the lay, were posing to the church a new questions, essentially, because the church couldn't limitate to condemn the widely spread aspiration to apostolic life, of course, and in a certain measure the church had in fact to second it in a certain sense, together with the spirit of renewal that the Christian society expressed with ever greater clarity, right? Nor it was possible to continue to marginate and criminalize these ferments with operations that, exasperating the contrast, would end up to actually drive away from the community of Christians also those new strengths that from its within could have actually contributed effectively to the healing of the old evils, let's say. So naturally, the church, in my opinion, had the Roman Church specifically had a they worked pretty cleverly, and there wasn't even this moment of let's say of total, like say at one point, I don't know, we have to get rid of these old, like it wasn't feasible, it wasn't thinkable either. And in my opinion, it would be interesting to deepen how let's say throughout all this period, how actually the church had immediately began to assimilate all of these groups in part, while others were, naturally condemned in case of extremism. So even posing the question in these terms is excessively stressing the contrast of the ecclesiological problem, right? Because objectively, these people lived in the way they wanted, even if the church had, thought otherwise. Like how can you control tens of millions of people that are, all that think on their own? That's not what the church ever did at the end of the day. There was a control, of course, on the communities. There was an attention from the authorities, the ecclesiastical ones, to maintain an order. But the real problems with these communities emerged when there was an actual problem of order, of unrest. I mean, it wasn't just a mere, let's say, ideological problem, right? How could they stem that? How could stem an idea from, let's say, from being spread? It's something very difficult to think, especially in 12th and 13th century Europe, where you had at this point so many other ideas spreading in other fields. Think about Aristotelianism, excuse me, that was initially banned by the church, eventually integrated because they couldn't do otherwise. So here, in my opinion, the level was different. This was more of at a lower level of experiences that were felt even without actually a great deal of studying or commitment, or of actual intellectual commitment. Right, these were broader movements that had other roots other than strictly religious ones, and that were essentially asking to live also in ways that were objectively competitive to others. So to the establishment. So the establishment at the time was essentially what the world society kind of drew its base from. So whether of course there was a loss of freedom widespread at the time in a certain social strata, but that's the point. It's not strictly ecclesiastical. It's religious, spiritual. It's something more, and the what could be the outcome of this kind of the most kind of extremistic integralist positions, right? What could they really produce at the end of the day? What alternative to that social and political order could they achieve? Because we have seen how nowhere you find a religious movement that is even if you look at Islam in the same time, there were objectively religious groups that were kind of founding something on its own, but we're still living within a a sphere of power that was competing with the orthodoxy, for example. So it's not strictly religious. It's just kind of the two things together, without a possibility of accepting the one without essentially giving power to another, right? And it's obvious that, you know, probably it was better it ended in this way. And the fact that there is the proof of this, because for how widespread these movements were, if these guys had a truly spiritual kind of religious problem with what the Church of Rome was doing, but it would have been impossible for the Church to frame them and to stabilize the situation and to contain these movements all over Europe and in areas, by the way, that were quite autonomous on their own. Of course, there were permanences of these movements, but most of them were genuinely interested in spiritual affairs that didn't interfere at a certain social level with an actual overthrow of subversion of society, right? So, the repression was dramatic, but that this situation was, strictly speaking, just an intellectual problem for which the Church of Rome was able to impose its own version of the story. Well, it's difficult to believe, because also those other positions were actually quite intolerant on their own. Like you can't, for whichever reason they did it, they were uncompromising, and that's where you get the repression, actually, because otherwise the Church wouldn't mind. The Church normally had a kind of conciliatory approach that we show displayed here in a normal way, and that's why there are the Franciscans and the Dominicans, because these are all groups that the Roman Church accepted without actually renouncing to any of its policies before. And the beginning of the 13th century is the victory of orthodoxy at so many levels, right? So there was a compatible picture that could be drawn without resorting to violence, to clash, to confrontation. Let's say a great figure in this, we also made a video about him, but only one, which is astonishing that over almost 600 videos we didn't talk about this figure more. Is Innocent III, that is indeed easily the greatest pope of the Middle Ages, probably of all of also those who came later, and who at the beginning of his pontificate applicated much more articulated religious policy than the one adopted by its own predecessors. He promoted energetic repressive actions. He also sharpened the instruments of control of religious subversion, as in the case of the Albigensians. That, for example, was a case that was openly conflicting with the Roman Church. As such, there was really the idea that this broad area of southwestern France could essentially go out there on its own to form its own state, its own church, right? And that was the main deal. And this is also proof how, by the beginning of the 3rd century, there were much serious problems. Also, the Waldensians had initially said, okay, we will, if you recognize our lay preaching, we will support you against the Cathars as well. So you can see even in the Waldensian movement, for example, how they of course wanted out these elements, or at least what they could. They had this idea that the orthodoxy was necessary at some levels as well. So it was never like a true uncompromising conflict on the very roots of what the church had to be. And the closer it got to that, the more conflict escalated, because there was no other way to reconcile it in any other way. Whether these experiments were doomed since the beginning, I don't know. I personally think, especially during the 12th century, was an actual risk that of a major split also in Western Christianity at some levels. But objectively, if we were to motivate the outcome of this, well, we already did it before. The Roman Church was better organized, right? Innocent III is very important in this sense because he, among all the other things, like the Roman Church during the pontificate of Innocent III had the largest secular power of all of Catholicism, right? Quite easily. It was like there was a moment in which basically every European monarch in Western Europe, at least, was formally kind of obedient or vassal to the Pope. An enormous influence, and we made many videos also on the clash that between the Otto of Brunswick, the Hohenstaufen, and the northern France that was allied with the papacy in England against them instead. So it's I mean, not against the church as such, but against France, and therefore this broader international situation was quite complicated, so that even the papacy at that point actually won probably the greatest clash. That was that one, even before, of course, the Cathars that were just a kind of a regional threat, but not to a direct, let's say, altering factor, let's say, of the Roman Church establishment, as instead the imperial influence could be, because at that point they could literally revert to this, but still in an orthodoxy context, by the way. But let's not digress too much. What I was saying is that Innocent III aimed at defining sharply the borders with heresy, right? There couldn't be any. A great problem had been this one. There had to be a more efficient way of determining which positions were reconcilable and which weren't, right? And so the clever thing was that this could highlight those movements that were already tending to essentially oppose the church and its dogmas, even if they hadn't explicitly done it yet, and those who can instead, be disciplined and controlled, right? And paradigmatic in this sense was Innocent's work with the Humiliated that were already settled in northern Italy during the 70s of the 12th century. And this group had been condemned together with the Waldensians in the Ad Abolendum Decretal. At the end of the 12th century, some of these Humiliated that actually were mostly workers of wool manufacturing. So all these were also workers, city workers, etc. Some of them had gone to Innocent III himself to negotiate with him a formula through which obtaining a canonic legitimization of their experience, and the principal problem to surpass was similar to the one that had already created so many difficulties to the Waldensians, which was the authorization not just to live but also to preach the evangelic poverty and the existential choice of the apostles. So the suspect that from the side of local environments the hierarchies was fed that was fueling towards this group is exemplified, for example, by the chronicler of Burkhard von Ursbach that described the Humiliated as first of all not having any authorization or permission from the side of the priests, and that instead literally threw the falcons in other people's harvest, basically. So they preached to the people and they tried to direct their existence. Now, this is very interesting because it tells you how these movements were theoretically aimed to getting, in fact, a sounder structuration, and it's obvious. Like, this is essentially what all the great movements do. Like, I don't want to stress different parallelisms, but I mean, these are things that really happen. Like, if you have read Orwell, you know what we're talking about here. The concept is that you can give an illusion to people to obtain something, but with the aim still of controlling, of structuring. So even when we criticize the elites here, saying, well, there was all this oppression, this inquisition, etc. But have you ever wondered what, it would have been if those things had not been there? Like, this is serious, but it's been there throughout all the ages, and this has nothing to do with human rights. Human rights were invented like last century. In this time, nobody knew anything like this. There were human rights in Nuce, let's say, contained in the same Christian message, for example, but not only, also in the more ancient juridical traditions, etc. But there must be an order of some kind. Like, orthodoxy is there always. These things were happening now in Christianity, how they were happening at the same time in Islam, right? There's always been an orthodoxy and then an heterodoxy, and there's been a clash, and there's been a repression, and there's been a resistance, right? And these are things that happen all the time, even in our own world. And it's kind of, probably. I know that it sounds like a judgment, like saying that these were kind of extremists, right? You understand that I tend towards the orthodoxy in general terms. Like, if, societies tend to work in a certain direction generally because that's the direction that works better. Like, you can't, most of the ideas that come to regulate society at the end of the day follow especially pragmatic tracks, right? When you start pretending that a society has to be in a certain way and wishing it to impose to everybody and to have it like that, becomes extremism. Call it what you want, and it can even reach power. Look at totalitarianism during the 20th century. That is real, right? But it breaks at one point because there is an inherent threat that this mindset poses, right? You could say, well, maybe if you are from the side of orthodoxy, then I don't know, in Nazi Germany you would have been from the side of it. Well, no, because at that point there was a world orthodoxy that said, okay, this is sick, and we gotta wipe them out, right? And this came as well with other means that were totalitarian at the same time. There were the Soviets from one side that contributed to that. But at the same time, that there was a general consensus that whatever that thing was, it was wrong, right? And this is something that at the end of the day, the establishment is generally aware of, right? And this doesn't mean that the establishment doesn't do pretty messed up things, as we have just observed, but at the same time, there is a way more concrete element to this story of how hierarchies are needed for that is actually functional. Because if it wasn't like that, by this time we would have already kind of wiped out each other, instead than just being here and having dramatically improved our lifestyle, lifespan, and I mean quality of life, I mean at the beginning, and so on. So there is been a progress, and even if it passed through repression, through violence, through violation of rights, whatever, generally speaking, it also brings something better to the large majority. And this is kind of it is controversial, because what's the majority at this point? It's like the 50% plus one, because that's how you can justify, in fact, the same totalitarianism that in some cases rose to power even with democratic means. But if you look, I think you can find exceptions throughout all history, but they are exceptions. There is a rule that is something different, right? That is milder overall. The Burkhard von Ursberg writes also here that the humiliated, for example, listened to the confessions, substituted the priests in the administration of sacraments, and furthermore, being rough and illiterate, other very interesting information here, they dedicated to manual work, manual labor, and they preached, receiving the necessary from those who believed in them, right? So this is interesting because it's even more thought-provoking because it starts all like a minority as well. This is not the humiliated were a minority wherever they were, right? And yet there was someone who backed them, and who and that in this picture were perceived, however, someone who ultimately just wanted to control these communities. Naturally, this chronicle is biased as well, but at the same time, it's still realistic in thinking how it was developing. So, coming to the integration in the body of the church of these movements, Innocent III was actually disposed to recognize the admission of the humiliated's requests, right? But at the price of their integration in the body of the church. So this brought to the formulation of a rule that was drawn greatly from the Benedictine and Augustinian ones, through which, albeit admitting certain requests of the humiliated, also another new religious order was created, and towards which confluated several in with the the clothes of male and female canonics, right? Regular canonics, those groups that had led a communitary life in the sense. For the lay that lived within their own houses, like actually the older traditions of the movement had allowed and emphasized, was approved through a collection of moral and devotional norms, a so-called propositum vitae, right? So a proposal of life, like as a rule, right? Through which was wasn't accepted, like wasn't created a real order as such. Right? So this wasn't a real rule either, right? But at least it was legitimized within the orthodoxy. This exclusively lay associative formula, within which was recognized the right to preach around certain moral arguments that were defined generically as verbum exhortationis, right? And always, however, having demanding in exchange the consensus of requiring actually the consensus of ecclesiastical authority. And this is a very meaningful recognition, in virtue of which were definitely excluded from the competence of the layman the arguments of preaching tied, for example, to faith or to the sacraments. That was what the church at that point had, in fact, mostly been concerned of. It also prevented dangerous intrusions in doctrinal matters, but also it didn't kind of mortify the aspirations of the religious commitment of the group, that instead was addressed towards a capillary action of containment of heresy itself. So this speaks for the work of civilization that the Church of Rome enacted here. They really managed to understand what these people wanted and negotiated with it, and they agreed in some of their instances, but always remaining within orthodoxy, and these groups were favorable to it and even willing to, at that point, to fight heresy on behalf of the same Roman Church. Right, so this is what I call a civil agreement, right? And that happened without the need of butchering anyone, of burning anyone, and it was consensual. And yeah, and you can't say, of course, it was a perfectly like no deal is cent% fair, like it's advantage 50-50, like but it was something that they managed to do, to agree, not only without shedding blood, but also building something together, which is very, very meaningful. And there is a beautiful passage from Jacques de Vitry that writes that in the first decades of the 13th century, Milan was a pit of heretics, right? and among these, it was only the Humiliated, with their authorized preaching, to oppose actively to the overflowing influence of the Cathars, right? So in this case, you see, in one of the major cities in Europe at the time, these pauperistic-evangelical heterodox tendencies were quite alive, and these groups therefore didn't just the Humiliated actually didn't have just to, in fact, get worried about what the church thought, but also what these other groups did, because that was the point, right? This is often overlooked as well. The picture is not that, from one side you have the Roman Church, and from the other all these groups, and it's just a clash between the two. There are many intersections, and actually they all act at a certain level in similar fashion. So it's very meaningful to observe how this Humiliated managed to even accept that they had to struggle against other groups, and it could get very violent here. So think of what it meant. So the reintegration within the ecclesiastical body of the Humiliated and their instances, and also the creation of a compact lay group under the guide of the institutionalized branch of the order, if one from one side channeled one of the great moments of religious descent within canonically controllable form, from the other side it also, however, stamped its flow, like from as it's been observed, the solution that was enacted for the Humiliated obviously subtracted to the circuit of lay religious groups a component, and it left open a gap that would be filled only with the emergence of new forms of religious life that would become essentially the mendicant orders that would manage at that point, and in that way, to reabsorb within the Catholic orthodoxy the aspirations that had permeated of themselves the religious lay movement of the 12th century. That's another story, and we will see another time. And as a matter of fact, I actually made some video about the I think just one, telling the truth. Let me check the mendicant orders, and I remember here. Yes, I made something about them, but chiefly it's the success of mendicant orders, yes, and Dominicans and Franciscans, the genesis of mendicant orders as well. So were some of my first videos. Maybe I should remake them because they aren't so brilliant, telling the truth, but even less than these videos actually. But they kind of speak at that point for the from a general perspective, telling the truth, compared to the one we have observed today, how the capacity, the ultimate capacity that eventually the mendicant orders would have to actively reabsorb all of these lay instances to create essentially a different monastic model. That was the urban one, and all, let's say, essentially the lay space that was created in parallel with them for allowing the common people that didn't want to become priests or nuns to participate in part of spiritual life in this associative forms, right? In this particular life. So actually, as you understand from today's video, this topic is very wide. Like, it doesn't stop just to the most obvious dichotomy between these were groups that were fundamentally, dissident, and at one point they were repressed or absorbed, right? There was an active behavior and participation to these same groups, to this civil choice of the Dominicans were born out of fighting Catholicism as well. So you understand that probably many of these groups, I mean, surely from a historical point of view, they can't be considered like external to what already the Catholic Church essentially was, right? Up to the point, of course, with other, that in other contexts, like what is called the Catholic one, had instead decided to take other directions, right? And that's from within the same groups that emerges a reaction, and that is eventually possible to compensate for it by integrating them within the Roman Church as something on their own, but still capable of, let's say, leaving their spiritual ambitions in a satisfactory manner, right? And I'm definitely not an expert of this type. Like I admit, I've studied at university. I like history of religion. I studied history of Christianity, but completely different things from these. So even as a medievalist, I actually never made an exam on, I don't know, mendicant orders or the heresies, etc. And I've always found these topics kind of difficult to digest, in the sense that they're so diversified and multi-layered that it's kind of difficult for me to move easily in them with nonchalance, let's say. So probably I'm also not very deep in my explanations, but I suspect that at least we can start to talk about them and to give a bit of dimension to it. So okay, for now we stop here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.